And I would be happy just to say some words of introduction. Firstly, thank you to all of you for joining us this evening, wherever you are. This event is to celebrate a recently completed book of writings by Álvaro Siza. Later, we will have a conversation, and I'm very much looking forward to moderating this. This event is hosted by the Institute of Urban and Landscape Studies at the Academia de Mendrisio, in collaboration with Monade Books, who are based in Lisbon, Portugal. I would like to thank my colleagues at the Academia for organizing this event, frankly, with very little notice, particularly Enrico Sassi, Alberto Canepa, and Marco de la Torre. Naturally, I would like to thank Álvaro Siza, Kenneth Frampton, Daniela, João Gomes de Silva for agreeing to take part in this event this evening. I would like to say a few words of introduction, although two of the contributors to this event are both, frankly, so famous that it is almost an unnecessary task. Álvaro Siza and Kenneth Frampton are two legendary figures in architectural practice and architectural theory. Álvaro Siza is no stranger to the Academy in Mendrisio. He is the author of many of the finest buildings in contemporary architectural culture. Pritzker Prize winner and more or less every other award in architecture. His work has always explored the culture of architecture at the very highest level. Kenneth Frampton, professor at Columbia in New York and author of many seminal books on architectural history and theory, including Modern Architecture, A Critical History, Studies in Tectonic Culture, Labor, Work, and Architecture, amongst many others. He was a professor in Mendrisio in the late 1990s. We're also joined by Daniela, who in a moment will speak about the making of this book. She was born in Porto, is an architect, a research editor, and founding director of Monade Publishing House. João Gomes de Silva is a landscape architect. His practice is called Global Landscape Architecture, and a long-standing collaborator as a landscape architect working with Álvaro Siza. He's a professor in Mendrisio and also in Lisbon. Finally, I am Jonathan Sergison, partner in the architectural practice Sergison Bates Architects in London and in Zurich, and a professor at the Academy in Mendrisio and the director of the Institute of Urban and Landscape Studies. So to begin, Daniela, Kenneth Frampton, João Gomes de Silva, and I will speak about the publication and a relationship that we all have to Álvaro Siza's work more generally. I would kindly ask that you limit your contribution to 10 minutes each, because what is then important is the conversation that will follow. Daniela, can I pass over to you, please?
Well, I would like to thank to the Institute of Urban and Landscape Studies at the Academy of Architecture of Mendrisio, directed by Jonathan Sergison, for hosting this conversation about the book that is here, as I was shown previously, now published by Monade in its first English edition. It has been for a long time a great companion of my years of studying architecture here in Porto. And also for that, thank you so much, Álvaro Siza, for this book and for the work. It's always very inspiring, and for being here today, completing this most extraordinary group of speakers. So thank you so much, Kenneth Frampton. It's really an honor João Gomes da Silva, a great friend, Jonathan Sergison. It's a privilege to be here today with you in this conversation. So, and the first thing would be that also this book is a consequence of a long conversation. It was made in 1998 during 3 recording sessions with a late collaborator, Italian collaborator, Guido Giangregorio. And the book is made on those sessions. They were long, they were taped, and then written on text. And it is very interesting to see that the issue of this book, which makes him very, very precious, it is about his own process of working. So it will be just kind of an answer on the question, how did you do some of your works? How did you get there? So there is a very mysterious question. It is a very wonderful issue to think about, to think where does good ideas come from, how to deal with struggles to objectives to troubles and to success, of course. And maybe the first thing that on this pursuit on how did I do some of my works, maybe just in the beginning of the book, I will show in here, just in the beginning, you can see this quote, a very provocative one. To begin with, the obsession of originality is an unrefined and rudimentary process. And beside this quote of non-going with this pursuit for originality is this drawing of a blank page. So how do I start? How do I think on a project? And maybe a few pages later, there is like, it's a name of a chapter, but maybe it's like a clue, a hint. And Siza says to us, to repeat is never to repeat. And we see it, for instance, in the first drawing of the book, that is an imagined city that somehow it's familiar to us. I don't know if it exists. I surely not, but I can identify some figures, some forms like this, almost Piazza Navona, a figure of a church, some similarities of his own work, but nevertheless is a non-existent city. So it's an imagined city, but it has some clarity, some familiarity with this evidence, with these other examples that repeat, maybe is not repeating. And that, of course, it comes from the use of drawing. And one of the most beautiful challenges that me and João Carlos Simões, also architect, that we are both editors of the book, that we have to deal with was this book is almost 1 page of text and 1 page of drawing. So it's almost equal in the amount of drawings and text. And how to deal with that? How to deal with very different narratives, different natures of discourse on the same thing. So we started to think that maybe the common part would be this very essential black ink. And that's why we have this very white book where the black ink stands out so much. So it's like the common factor. Because here, and that is a very strong point in this book and also in Siza's process, the images are not illustrations of an idea. They are the idea in the making. So they do not illustrate the text, they go side by side. They are like 2 different discourses. And matching these 2 lines was a very challenging exercise for us as editors. And it was very beautiful to think that it is like a second path of thinking project as a way of thinking. And a way of thinking not only of architecture, but of life, of memories. So it's full of personal, also personal details, memories that goes on in this making of an idea. And that's why it's so, this book is so extraordinary, because it's one of the few that in which we find an author with courage enough and with generosity enough to address to this such difficult question. How do I make my own, some of my own projects? And of course, we did not see some clear statements without any point of doubt. It's the opposite. And we see that in the title, because the title is almost an opposition, because we have this imagining, which sounds very mysterious and foggy. And on the other point, we have the evident. So something that is very clear to our eyes. So we have this double thinking on doubts, on wonderings of his own process, and it's really it's an enormous privilege to have access to this kind of documents. So thank you so much, Siza, and you can, of course, see more information of the book in our web page, more images, some texts about, and we are constantly making some new points on it. And I think it's really a great privilege to have edited and also helped to translate a book that was a great companion of mine when I was an architectural student. So thank you so much. I am really looking for hearing your comments on this book.
And I would be very happy to invite Kenneth Frampton to pick things up. Thank you.
Well, I'm very happy to be present, of course, and I also received the book, which since it's translated into English, I have read for the first time in my life, and have read and reread, of course. And yes, there are many things in it which I would like to comment on, but here are a few, and I've written out this this contribution in an attempt to somehow keep to the sacrosanct 10 minutes. And so let me do that. I will sort of part ad-lib, part read. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this book for me is the way it exemplifies Álvaro's fluid manner of sketching, designing, and writing, that which Vittorio Gotti beautifully evoked with the term, his reference to Siza's calligraphy. I love that idea. And it is as though this discourse, both drawn and written, invites others into conversation with Siza himself. And I think in a way, this is borne out in the book, because at the end of the book, there are two addenda, one by Vittorio Gotti, the late Vittorio Gotti, written in 1998 for the original publication, and one by Daniela of 2021. And what is fascinating for me is how they both enter into discourse with the book in a very dynamic way. And so let me begin with the first one, which is Gotti's 1998 gloss on the book, which in relation to Álvaro's work is yet further proof, if any were necessary, that, in my view at least, Gotti is one of the most sensitive architectural critics of our time. I mean, I think his perceptions are without equal in a way. particularly in terms of their sensitivity. It is, after all, he who points out Siza's exceptionally subtle transformation of Robert Venturi's reductive populism. I think that's really, really kind of an amazing contribution. And I mean, he has more to say about Venturi's own work being limited by the superstructure of the United States, to coin this famous Marxist term. And but also, you know, the other kind of insight of Grigotti's, I think, is to think of Siza's work as an archaeology, and a kind of living archaeology of itself, so to speak. It's an archaeology not only of the actual given site and the program, but the archaeology, the kind of ongoing archaeology of the process of designing. And above all, this play between the visible and the invisible, which in the book, Álvaro identifies very dramatically, in fact, with regard to the design of the museum to Santiago de Compostela. And above all, of course, the buried watercourses and the hidden foundations, which are gradually recovered with help, local help, in the process of actually designing the project, the museum and the garden, of course, together. And which in itself is, again, of course, proof of Grigotti's analogous reading of Álvaro's work as an archaeology. Somewhere, I'm not sure that it's in this book after all, but I think it might be, I've now forgotten, there is this evocation on the part of Álvaro of what the site wants to be, you know. And of course, it's very enigmatic. It kind of parallels in a way Lou Kahn's what the brick wants to be, you know. But I think there is this aspect of Siza's early work on any project on a site, which is a kind of feeling towards what the site might become in terms of actual drawing and sketching and writing. And this is particularly poignant, I think, in this amazing aerial sketch of Malagueira, in which one sort of has this kind of illusion when you look at the drawing long enough, that the housing scheme and the various segments of the housing scheme that was eventually built are kind of emerging from the page as you look at the drawing, you know. And at the same time, you realize as you go on looking at the drawing that one's looking at an aerial sketch of an imagined ruined residential fabric, because that clearly is not not something that one could see from the air, you know. In any case, presumably Álvaro imagines seeing it from the air, and it's not actually in the air. And one is reminded at this juncture, in part because of the text, the very yes, the text about originality as an unrefined process. This obsession, this obsession with originality as an unrefined process. One is reminded of something, I think, which you have said on many occasions. Architects don't invent anything, they transform reality. I think that's one of the most profound aphorisms that I've ever read with regard to this field which is very much a material culture. And So this idea of transformation of reality, an ongoing, never-ending transformation of reality, in fact. This brings me to the other point, which I find incredibly powerful in the book, is this categoric statement: architecture without nature is meaningless. I mean, that for me is maybe the one single statement in the book which is more arresting than any other, you know. And of course, for Siza or for many, I mean, this question of nature is also inseparably involved with the idea of landscape. And I was recently looking at these unbelievably euphoric sketches that you made in the early 90s for the Getty Museum in Malibu. And I mean, they are unbelievable. And there the landscape is on the move, you know. The landscape is as dynamic as the building, as the imagined building. And they are a most beautiful set of sketches. And it brings me also, it provokes in me the thought, you know, that there are certain buildings that never got built, among them the League of Nations, or for example, the Smithson's project for Coventry Cathedral, which if they had been built would have totally altered the subsequent development of the field. And I think this also applies to the museum in Malibu. I mean, it's very regrettable, in my opinion, that this work was not, yes. And in the competition, Álvaro didn't prevail. You know, I think it's extremely regrettable. And landscape, or rather nature and architecture in relation to nature, also brings up for me another, you know, very powerful little vignette in the book, which is your childhood memories of being in Valencia and coming to the edge, to the limit of Valencia before an orange grove, you know, the border, the absolute border between the city and the countryside. And of course, you understandably, like many of us, you I think lament the loss of the city, but more importantly, maybe the loss of the boundary of the border between urban fabric and open countryside. And the other moment in the book, which is very important to me, is this reference to Fernando Távора's, what you call his hard intuition. I love that phrase, the combination of hard intuition, with regard to the Boa Nova restaurant, where he selects a particular segment of the rock formation overlooking this grotto celebrated by Antonio Nobre, the Romantic poet, and says, this is where it has to be. This is where the site, where the building has to be. And what, yes, I just, and you remarked that it was also difficult to put it in that place, you know. But this term, hard intuition, brings up, of course, the other postscript to the book, which is Daniela Sa's 2021 Afterward, which focuses on intuition and on, she quotes Goethe. I didn't know about Goethe and intuition, but also Schoenberg, and the importance of intuition, the key of intuition in relation to creativity. And I think, of course, we can say informed intuition. That's an important aspect. This is what I think Siza means by hard intuition. You know. Yes, and this emphasis on intuition And by the way, you know, Eric Mendelsohn also was of that opinion. So yeah, this is the main points that I wanted to make at the beginning. Thank you.
Kenneth Frampton, thank you very much. João Gomes de Silva, relationships to landscape have just been mentioned in Kenneth Frampton's commentary. I would be delighted if you could pick things up from here.
So I thank so much for allowing me to be here between you, among you. I would like to share some ideas about the book that hit me, and but mostly from my personal experience of collaborating with Álvaro Siza as a landscape architect in the beginning of my practice back in 1985. So imagining the evidence again. Imagining the evidence from this new edition in English allow us to think how so many of Álvaro Siza's ideas presented in the 1998 Italian editions remain current, probably because they are eternal. In the first paragraph of the opening text, to repeat is never to repeat, Álvaro Siza states, the relationship between nature and construction is essential in architecture. It is an obsession, as it were. Throughout history, this relationship has always been determinant, but nowadays it is on a progressive path towards extinction. I stop quoting. I have collaborated with Álvaro Siza since the beginning of my practice back in 1985 at the construction site of Bairro da Malagueira, and this question emerged from the first task he assigned me, that of modeling the land, recycling the excavated material for the implantation of one of the sectors under construction. When he returned to the construction site 1 week later, Álvaro Siza observed the reprofiling that absorbed those materials and agreed. I think I gained his trust. Soil as a fundamental matter of landscape as construction became one of the structural aspects of the Malagueira landscape work. We also discussed the importance of water as a present matter and understood the meaning of the word Malagueira in the local slang, poorly drained land. The design of the water as an element of the project acquired spatial significance. The need to create crossings over the Ribeira led to the design of the pontão, this hydraulic structure, which is a bridge, which is a viewpoint and a pedestrian walkway. Then the dike was designed, a work of urban hydraulics, which allows the elevated passage of the footpath towards the center of Évora, initially imagined by Álvaro Siza in its first sketches on Malagueira, as we remember. The level pathway on the back of the dike, raised from the marshy land on the valley, has generated an accumulation of water, a lake, which is fed by the water from the stream that runs underneath the Quinta da Malagueira, originating from the rain and flows from the municipal swimming pools upstream. A natural spring of water at the upper point of Malagueira land became evidence that allowed us to imagine a garden. As the original source of water, the natural matter that fertilizes the soil and allows plants and animal life, its gravitational path between the origin and the waterline became the pretext for the narrative of its movement. To accumulate, conduct, distribute, alternate, irrigate, concentrate, and deliver are verbs that describe the spatial device that constitutes the garden. Having developed an hypothesis of garden in 4 successive terraces for my final thesis in landscape architecture, Álvaro Siza became interested in this hypothesis and explored design in which the combination of the three great tectonics of landscape, soil, water, and vegetation, built singular space unique for its configuration and complexity, and for the sophistication of its architectural form. So starting from a spatial system of 4 terraces surrounded by adobe walls that determined the direct and indirect accesses between them, the water constituted the second structural aspect after the topographic construction of the terraces with adobe walls, chaining a sequence of hydraulic elements of great architectonic clarity. The first tank is quadrangular and gathers the water from the spring and channels it to the second tank already inside the garden enclosure. This octagonal element in marble stone distributes the water to 2 lowered and densely planted flower beds or to the next tank. This one has a lead with a spiral groove that makes the water execute this movement before storing itself. The sequence follows to the second and third terraces between marble tanks and adobe beds, flower beds, making the water rise by gravity or descend in an inclined marble plan to finally deposit itself in a large and calm tank before flowing to Ribeira or recycling to the initial tank during the period of water scarcity in summer. So this natural artifice constituted the garden, also made by natural matters like the soil, the clay transformed into adobe, the marble and granite stone of the region, the exotic vegetation by contrast with the local, and the water originated there and there metamorphosed in this sequence of spaces that welcome us in the heat of Évora. Other projects of smaller and larger scale have been developed in relation with to the Malagueira open spaces, which have shown the dozens of sketches that Álvaro Siza delivered to me as a basis for work, and which accumulated an imaginary about this place. Then we visit some nearby recreation farms, Quinta da Malagueira, Quinta do Chantre, Quinta das Glicínias, which fed this imaginary represented by tanks, fountains, pergolas, and many other elements and circumstances that the sketches show, and which became evidence for the project. Sometimes later, Álvaro Siza was starting the construction of the School of Education in Setúbal, and asked me to discuss with him the implantation on the terrain due to doubts about the topography and the presence of cork oaks. I arrived in military uniform and we took a long look at the implantation stakes which marked the polygon of the building and the respective levels. What was the right level to avoid over-excavation or a too little artificial leveling? Or too artificial leveling to avoid the proximity of beautiful mature cork oaks were some of the questions that Álvaro Siza obsessively tried to understand to make his final decision. Afterwards, a delicious roast lamb was eaten at the work site to celebrate the implantation. Months later, the landscape project was developed, which reconciled the underlying topography with the beautiful trees, adding shrub vegetation and a stone path. A small undulation inside the slightly sloping surface of the courtyard marked the memory of the original topography. The very same intuition that Fernando Tavra had stated about the layout of the Boa Nova tea house. The building should be here, seems to have guided the evidence of the imagined layout for the school. Before starting the collaboration in Malagueira, I made a study trip coinciding with the end of my studies, and our professor, architect Paulo Gouveia, took us to Álvaro Siza's studio, and then we visited for 2 days some of his work, especially the ones most related with landscape. The swimming pools of Quinta de Nossa Senhora da Conceição, 1965, integrated in a park designed by Fernando Tavra and Ilídio de Araújo, and the swimming pools of Lessa de Palmeira, 1966-73. The visit to the piscinas de Lessa caused me a deep emotion, first when approaching without glimpsing them, then when discovering a ramp and a zigzagging support wall, I descended it and felt the compression of a concrete slab ceiling turning to the lights, and now narrow path between walls, and at the end an angled wall that makes me look at the light that blinded me. When my eyes got used to the raw light of the north coast, I contemplated sand, concrete steps, water flat between rocks, and the immense sea with the waves battling in foam. This moment, which we experienced in silence, me and my colleagues, was only disturbed by the noise of the waves, which grew as we approached the end of this labyrinth. I remember thinking an obviousness, the obviousness of what architecture is and how it builds landscape. This moment changed my life at the exact moment when I started to become a landscape architect. Recently, I wrote a text about this coast, the three works that determine it, connected by a wall and a road: the chapel, the tea house, and the pools of Lessa. We do not know the author of the first one. The others are by Álvaro Siza. Measurement, something that defines architecture and landscape, is determined by the alignment of these three works and by the limit that is established there between land and sea. Álvaro Siza states in the book, a wall retaining the urban area delimits the beach, rocks, and sea, and all the force of Atlantic. Nature had barely been disturbed there, he said. A wall, as an architectural element of the North Coast landscape, constitutes the transition between two representative entities of natural and the artificial, which is the humanized landscape. And it is this wall which wrinkles and fragments, forming the pools of Lessa, or the tea house which encrusts itself between rocks, the building should be here, until it becomes confused with them. It is this same relation between natural and built which Álvaro Siza refers to, and which becomes the motive and measure of architecture, is architecture. Then, studying carefully the horizontal and especially the vertical dimensions, we understand how the shelter of the swimming pools appears, where only 2.7 meters of difference of level between the coastal platform and the beach level. The leveling quotes refer to nearby rocks at tide level that sometimes fill the pools, but they are also refers to our body as an architectural dimension. There were other works in which I could collaborate with Álvaro Siza: the house of Vieira de Castro, where rocks, topography, and vegetation completes the house; the church of Santa Maria, where the view from the horizontal window is filtered by birch trees; the garden surrounding the mortuary chapel; the garden of his office; and Serralves, where the implantation in the topography makes the building ubiquitous according to the angle of observation, and the vegetation of the north involves it, determining the angles of relation with other spaces. In all of them, one can understand how nature, as an objective thing expressed in topographic form, in the presence or absence of water, and in the relations with the vegetation, becomes fundamental matter of imagination, the imagination that carries us to the evidence of architecture. In one thing, I disagree with when Álvaro Siza affirms in the initial text referring to the relationship between nature and construction essential to architecture is not heading for extinction. It is more and more essential of what makes the architecture necessary to man in a world of transition as the one we live in. Thank you. Thank you, Álvaro Siza.
João, thank you very much for those thoughts that you have shared. I would like to say a few words, and they will also be slightly personal. And to begin with, just see if I can share my screen. Yes. Álvaro Siza, Imagining the Evident. More than any other architect I can think of, Álvaro Siza has inspired me throughout my career. I first visited his buildings in Porto as a fourth-year student of architecture. I am standing on the back row, second from the left, an earnest young version of myself. This was a study trip that we made in 1987, although I'd been aware of the buildings of Álvaro Siza throughout my studies. I was profoundly moved by what I encountered. But they were buildings that had to be seen for their many qualities to be evident. In part because invariably they make readings of place which can only be understood by seeing their context. And like great architecture, it has to be felt in real, not abstract terms. Naturally, we can understand some things about a project through studying drawings and photographs, but experiencing a building is different. And in the case of the work of Álvaro Siza, this physical encounter is, in my opinion, absolutely necessary. On the same day in 1989 that I handed in my diploma portfolio at the AA in London, I found myself working for Álvaro Siza in London on his entry for the Paris National Library competition. I cannot tell you how powerful a memory this was. I found myself sitting next to my hero, and his gentle encouragement and engagement with the task left a lasting impression. There are many aspects of Álvaro Siza's work that I could comment on, but the focus of this evening should be his writing and this wonderful book that has been produced. I can think of very few architects that can write and produce exceptional architecture. To do one or the other well is already a lot. I first encountered the writings of Álvaro Siza in translation into English in the Skira publication from 1997, entitled Architectural Writings. And I must state that I've reread these texts over the years. They are refreshingly candid and express the doubts and the frustrations that every architect has to manage. At times, they are poetic, and in other moments, conceptually very lucid, and always a pleasure to read. One particular text I enjoy is entitled Living a House. It describes so clearly the responsibility an architect has in designing a house that becomes a home and all that follows. There is humor in this text mixed with anxiety that the inhabitant of any house associates with. For any practicing architect, what is written is also so familiar. It reminds us that while the intensity of our involvement in a project finishes at the point when a building is realized, at this moment, the life of a house begins with its needs to be serviced, maintained, and the unpredictability that this always entails. On reading Imagining the Evident, I rediscovered the same wonderful voice and was particularly struck by the urban themes that are addressed. The relationship to urbanity is ever present in the book, and in the sense that the description of every project revolves around readings of places that already exist, and every project is accurately adding to places as part of a process of urban continuity. Álvaro Siza makes reference to his work in Macau, where the grid is employed as an urbanizing device and the understanding of its historical and cultural implications. He refers to his engagement in the task of the rebuilding of a Chiado district in Lisbon that was badly damaged by a fire in August 1988. And the possibility this offered in terms of re-establishing old lost pathways that existed in the city, but he was able to recreate and argued for them because they made sense. This was clearly a complex task of reuse at an impressive urban scale. Reference should also be made to the School of Architecture in Porto and the teacher training school in Setúbal. The former, a work that can be understood as an exercise in recreating a campus as a series of interrelated buildings. In both, there is an interest in space between, and here I'm thinking of the first year pavilion and the open courtyard space of Setúbal, or the museum in Santiago de Compostela, a building of great intensity with the most wonderful landscape. Álvaro Siza's work in Évora is one of the greatest housing settlements projects of the 20th century. Although it should be added that while the work began in the 1970s, it is still ongoing. A project that adds to the work of figures like Oud, Maya, Utzon, amongst others. It is a project I have visited and revisited on many occasions, and I find it utterly compelling. In imagining the evident, Álvaro Siza shares stories about its making and the manner in which it has evolved. There are 3 housing projects that are all outside of Portugal and which are all urban in character and masterful at every level, all contributed to the wider international standing that Álvaro Siza commands. The first is the remodeling of the urban block in Kreuzberg in Berlin with a collection of small public community buildings and the wonderful apartment building, Bonjour Tristesse. The second is the Campo di Marte project on the Giudecca Island in Venice. And the third is the housing in The Hague. This last example, although this comment could be made to all of them and many other projects, explores older housing models from the neighborhood of The Hague, and it interprets them. It also developed a very clear and simple device in plan to allow for the residents, who are mostly Muslim, to subdivide their homes in a manner that meets their cultural needs and traditions. The facades of the housing in The Hague reminds us that the role that should be played by an architect when making urban housing, they are simple, repetitive, beautifully proportioned, and create a carefully measured backdrop seen in relation to the older housing that surrounds them, and holding a similar form of decorum and urban good manners. In an age when lesser architects have been motivated to seek spectacle and strive for originality, Álvaro Siza reminds us that we should not seek to invent, only to rework things, and that perhaps in time, doing this for many years, something original might emerge. But it is necessary to know a site before it is possible to act. And we must always learn from a process of building. This wonderful book that I must thank you for, and the makers of the book, Monade, is full of lessons. And those include the need to be modest, to manage doubt, to be open-minded, and to be generous. Álvaro Siza, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So at this moment, I have to turn to all of you and begin a conversation, but I feel that this conversation surely must begin with you, Álvaro Siza. And I would like to ask, why, in your mind, the need to write? And what does writing mean for you? And I ask that question knowing that the act of writing for any practicing architect is difficult.
I began late, very late to write, because I began working in the 60s, beginning of 60s. And I wrote nothing. And I was afraid of writing, as when I had a command for a project in the early times, I was many times almost in panic, because I realized how difficult it was. In a way, I make so many sketches because of nervous in the moment of beginning of work. So I make some sketches on my mind, twice, little. And later I wrote the wonderful text by Álvaro, where he speaks about his relation with drawings, how when the work was blocked, he would get out of office, begin making drawings or paintings and so, and suddenly, and not thinking at all in architecture. And from that exercise sometimes was coming the idea to go on with the project, and we would turn again to the office and so when I began working, or when I began in school, I had no interest in architecture, no knowledge. I wanted to be a sculptor. My family convinced me that that was a hard bohemian life and not a good way of life. And then I went to something more respectful, as was architecture in the same school. Not so spectacle also for people, but a little better. And in the beginning was very difficult for me because I knew nothing. First class correction of the professor, of Carlos Ramos, the director. He told me, he looked at the drawings first time, and as usual, he would take a cigarette, make a cigarette, cut the points with a small
Scissor.
He brought home. I think that to think. And then he told me, I will not make a correction to your work. I looked at it and I understand it's clear that you know nothing about architecture. So I will not speak about it. I give you an advice. Go to a bookshop and buy some magazines of architecture. It was the best advice that I could receive. Because in the shop, there was only in Portugal at the time a Statue do Jubilee. I got the 4 last numbers, and one was Gropius, Walter Gropius. other was Neutra, the other was Alvarado, and the fourth one I didn't almost open because I was frightened what about big hospitals. I could say that. Then, first of all, Alvarado, looking at those buildings, something I had never seen, the curves of MIT or the exhibition hall in New York. So I was excited and enthusiastic. And I think that there I began being interested in architecture. And when I began, I had no experience. I knew not many people, only the local architects. And I began as I could. It was that the first work, public work I participated was Gomes restaurant. I went with the Tabra. He could not make competition. He asked the collaborators, 5 young, not diplomed, still architects, told us, you make the competition, and then I put the firm. And something today and impossible to think about. But he went there and he looked and he said, the restaurant must be here. And again, we were in panic. It was difficult with all those rocks and so, but went on doing it. And was in panic even today sometimes when I get something important project sometimes. So my main tool, I think, is the doubts. I work crossing doubts. That is also the reason why I make so many sketches. As sketches very quick, I can, without being much preoccupied in finding things, I can do this and try different things and then select and put out and in a moment to develop something and to, during this process, getting more deep information of the project. Because I always begin with little information about the program. So I like as well, simultaneous as I get ideas, so drawings or models or whatever, to have more information. I don't like to begin with the old information because I would be. And I could not imagine also that I was so happy with that. I could not imagine that Vittorio Gregotti would come to Porto by Hazard and have seen some first works. It was in a moment of sound, so after the revolution, everybody came to see the revolution, and many architects, and some of them discovered that also in Portugal, that there was architecture after Manuelino, there was something. And I could not imagine that he would be interested and write immediately about the work is with. And I could not imagine that Frampton, Kenneth Frampton, would be one day interested by my architecture, as he was interested by so many unknown architects around the world. And I had some other meetings by Hazard that were fundamental to me. And so I am very grateful to them. They gave me
Confidence.
confidence. They gave me confidence. I was very, I thought I was unable to do architecture in a way. So they gave me a lot of confidence. And then I made meet Mom, and I could, after Portuguese Revolution, I could make many tables. And because of the revolution and the work I made in some program for social housing for neighbors, and the way I was considered, and the other architects that worked in this program, because politics dominated, I was absolutely marginalized.
Put to the side.
Yeah. Happily, I had no work. And some of those architects that came to Portugal saw what I had made. And I had invitation to Berlin first, then to Holland, then to Italy, and so on and so on and so on. So imagine how lucky I was, because if there was not revolution in Portugal, and if my work would be well received, probably I would not have the possibility to see so many things and also to work. And other meetings with other people here in the panel, I see João that worked in Malagueira and brought very important ideas to Malagueira. For instance, the idea of the deck and putting a lake, artificial lake there, was his idea, because he saw that the water would go to that point by typography. And also, by the way, I did not make the drainage in tubes. I used the topography so that the water would go to a small line of water, and then it joined the swimming pool, municipal swimming pool, water that was constantly substituted, and then we made a lake. And the dig is where I had seen the zingari, no?
No, the gypsy, Roman people, gypsies.
That were still living in barracks in the area of Malagueira, and I have seen how they displaced to go to the town which is nearby. They made the natural and the easier way to go to the territory, to the center. And then I had a pre-plan for pedestrians made by people that live there. And I followed this. And I had to introduce some new things because the new areas changed a little the movements. I followed movements that existed, but something changed. And many times in those changes, I made mistakes. Because when being not so natural and living there as where the people there, I would choose some other way and it didn't result. So I had to change it. Then another lucky thing for me was the possibility to work in these programs for a number of people, for communities, and the contact I had with them, which was one aspect of the program of Portuguese government participation. So I met people, I met communities like Trevo, I met Alvarado, and then immediately came Niemeyer, appeared Tavra with a magazine with the Brazilian, Brazil Builds. So Niemeyer would come very well after Corbusier, which was the first protagonist for the students in school. I met those magazines. So I'm a lucky man in here. I have invitations. I could. Only bad thing is the cervical. No, today.
If I could just step in, Álvaro Siza, it's such a pleasure hearing your recollections about these projects. It's very much like rereading the book from my point of view. Kenneth Frampton, I have a question that I would like to ask you, and it's one that's been on my mind for a long time. This last semester in Mendrisio, I set as a part of the work that our students were doing, the need to read your chapter from A Critical History of Modern Architecture, but the chapter that deals with critical regionalism. And a question I would ask you is, when you wrote that text, which I think firstly appeared in Oppositions, the criteria that you list at the end of this text, for me, Siza fulfills all of the criteria that you list. And it's a question, I mean, I know that in that text, you look at the work of many people, including Mario Botta and Utzon, amongst others, but it feels that somehow Álvaro Siza is running through this text. Is that an invention on my part, or I would be happy to hear a word from you?
I don't know exactly how to answer it. I mean, I think it's interesting how I first became somehow kind of interested in regional expressions in Europe, because in this brief period, which was very rich for me, when I was technical editor of the magazine Architectural Design, which means, you know, between 60 and the end of 62, I was very aware of the fact that there seemed to be a more intimate relationship between architects in Europe, in what was left of European city-states, than what existed in England, for example. I mean, if I think of the provincial city in England, I thought there was no particular intimate relationship between any architect I could think of in Britain and the provincial city. And so I became aware of certain architects. I mean, Matthias Ungers in Cologne and Ernst Giesel in Zurich, which no one sure is not, well, it's perhaps not at all well known today, but was in the 60s. And Gino Valli in Udine in Italy. I sort of was, perhaps also was just simply an imaginary projection. And at some point, of course, the Ticino and Leo Galfetti and Mario Botta in Lugano and in Mendrisio, etc. And certainly Álvaro Siza, I mean, this is a sort of process of discovery that is initiated in the 60s, but which continues, I think. And And you know, if I think of all the kind of criteria that I listed at in this first version of the essay, Towards a Critical Regionalism of 1983, which was very much influenced by Alexonis Leander Febvre's The Grid and the Pathway, which was an appraisal of Dimitri Pikionis and Aris Konstantinidis in Athens. I mean, they also were architects that I was aware of. I mean, I first became aware of Pikionis and the Philopapu Hill manifestation in Athens in '59, when I sort of discovered it basically by accident. So Álvaro is you know, the work in the School of Porto, excuse me, is clearly part of that. And it's hard to say, you know, what is it exactly? You know, why do I think that these works, that this architect in this place rather than another architect in another place is more, comes more definitely towards an idea of critical regionalism. As I sort of itemize it, so to speak, in the text Towards the Critical Regionalism. And I suppose the last thing I would like to say about it is that having written this text, you know, I as part of a kind of effort on my own part to kind of re-ground architecture, so to speak, you know, for myself, really. I began to have doubts about the whole hypothesis, and this, in a sense, set me off in another direction towards this idea of tectonic. I was very impressed by João Gomes da Silva's use of the term tectonic and this idea of the three tectonics of landscape being soil, water, and how does it go? Soil, water, and what? Vegetation, of course. Yes, that's of the three tectonics. Yes, that I found just the use of the term tectonic in relation to these three, I found very arresting, stimulating. Not really an adequate answer to your question, but I don't know how to answer it in simple terms.
Well, I'm very happy with the answer. Many thanks. Daniela, I'm aware of time. I feel that it is my painful duty to bring this incredible event to a close. And at this point, Álvaro Siza, Kenneth Frampton, Daniela Sá, and João Gomes da Silva, many, many thanks for joining all of us for this wonderful exchange of thoughts and reflections. And thank you again for making this wonderful book, which I would recommend to everybody watching who doesn't have it already. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Standing.
Ciao. Álvaro, ciao.